Maggie Carter didn't cry when they nailed the foreclosure notice to her door. She cried when her 7-year-old son pulled her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, where are we going to sleep tonight?" She had no answer. 48 hours after burying her husband, the bank had already decided her family's fate. Everything Thomas Carter had worked for, every nail, every board, every midnight prayer, stripped away before the dirt on his grave had even settled. If you've ever felt the world turn its back on you, stay with me. Subscribe, follow this channel, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning they lost the house, the sky was the color of a bad promise. Maggie Carter stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known as a married woman, the home Thomas had built with his own 2 hands, plank by plank, summer after summer, and she held the paper in her fingers without reading it again. She had already read it 4 times. She didn't need a 5th. The words were the same each time: cold, legal, final. Behind her, through the thin wooden door, she could hear Clara moving around in the kitchen, the oldest at 13, and already trying to act like nothing was wrong, already trying to be strong, the way children do when they sense that the adults around them are barely holding together. Maggie could hear 8-year-old Henry arguing with 6-year-old James over something small and stupid, and completely irrelevant to the disaster descending on all of them, their voices climbing over each other the way boys' voices do. And underneath all of that, just barely audible, she could hear little Ruth, 4 years old, the baby. Thomas's last gift to this world, singing something soft and tuneless to herself in the back room. 4 children, 1 widow, $0. And a notice from Harlan Greaves at the First Territorial Bank of Millhaven, saying the property, the livestock lien, and all associated assets were to be vacated by sundown. Sundown was 9 hours away. Maggie folded the paper slowly, the way she folded everything, with care, with precision, with the quiet dignity that had always been her armor against a world that looked at her body and decided before she opened her mouth what kind of woman she was. She was a large woman. She had always been a large woman. She had learned early that the world made up its mind about large women fast, and it rarely made up a flattering one. So she had spent 31 years being twice as organized, twice as composed, twice as capable as anyone expected, because expectation was the wall she had learned to climb every single morning just to be seen as ordinary. She tucked the paper into her apron pocket and went inside. "Clara," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, "I need you to start packing." Clara turned from the stove. She had Thomas's eyes, dark and watchful, and too serious for a girl her age. "How much?" "Everything that matters." Clara didn't ask why. She just nodded and took the pot off the fire and walked toward the bedroom without another word. That was Clara, 13 years old and already carrying the weight of comprehension like a grown woman. It broke Maggie's heart every time she saw it. Henry looked up from the corner where he and James had been squabbling. "Mama, are we moving? We're going on a trip," Maggie said. The lie tasted bitter, but the truth would have been worse. "Help your brother pack his things, 1 bag each, just the important things." "What counts as important?" James asked. "Whatever you can't replace," Maggie told him. She went to the back room where Ruth sat on the braided rug with her rag doll, singing her quiet little nothing song, completely undisturbed by the world ending around her. Maggie crouched down, and Lord, her knees ached. They always ached. Now everything ached since Thomas died. Grief lived in the body as much as the mind, and she pressed her lips to the top of Ruth's soft hair. "We're going on an adventure, little love," she whispered. Ruth looked up with Thomas's mouth in Maggie's eyes. "Will there be biscuits?" "There will always be biscuits," Maggie promised. She didn't know how she was going to keep that promise. She didn't know how she was going to keep any promise. But she said it anyway because a 4-year-old's world should not yet contain the word foreclosure. She spent the next 3 hours moving through the house with mechanical efficiency, packing the quilts Thomas's mother had sewn, packing the children's winter coats, packing the small tin of coins she kept hidden in the flour barrel, which amounted to $2.14, which was everything, which was nothing. She packed the Bible with Thomas's handwriting on the front page. Their names, their wedding date. The children's birth dates recorded in his careful hand, and she pressed it against her chest for just a moment before placing it in the trunk because she could not afford to fall apart inside this house. She could fall apart later. She could fall apart when the children weren't watching. Harlan Greaves arrived at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which was early and deliberate and designed to humiliate. He didn't come alone. He brought Deputy Coulter, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, and he brought Fletcher Dowd, who handled the bank's property transfers, and who had never once in his professional life looked uncomfortable about anything. Greaves was a thin man with a thin mustache, and the kind of meticulous cleanliness that Maggie had always associated with men who never did any real work. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, with an expression that catalogued and dismissed in the same breath. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I trust you've had time to review the notice." "I have," Maggie said. She stood at the top of the steps with her arms at her sides and her chin level. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. "Then you understand the property reverts to the bank's custody as of today. We'll need you and your—" He paused, and his eyes moved briefly dismissively to where Henry and James had appeared in the doorway. "Your family to be gone by the time the sun touches the ridge." "My husband died 8 days ago," Maggie said. "I'm aware of that, ma'am. The bank's condolences." "The bank's condolences." She repeated the words back to him flat and clean, the way you'd set a dirty dish on a table. "Thomas Carter gave this bank 11 years of payments, Mr. Greaves. 11 years. And was unfortunately in arrears for the final 7 months? Yes." Greaves reached into his coat and produced his own copy of the paperwork, the gesture practiced and self-satisfied. The terms of the lien agreement were clear. In the event of default, in the event of a man dying in a mill accident and leaving a widow with 4 children, Maggie said, and her voice stayed even steady, the way a river stays even right before it floods. "You're telling me the bank moves on the house in 8 days. The bank has a fiduciary." "I know what fiduciary means, Mr. Greaves." She looked at him steadily. "I also know what decent means. Those are 2 different words." Something moved in Greaves's expression. Then not shame men. Like Greaves didn't carry shame, but irritation. The irritation of a man accustomed to women weeping and folding, who had encountered instead a woman who was doing neither. Deputy Coulter looked at his boots. Fletcher Dowd studied the fence post. "The law is the law." "Mrs. Carter," Greaves said finally. "It certainly is," she said. "Give me an hour." He gave her 45 minutes. The neighbors came out as she loaded the wagon, not to help to watch. That was the thing about Millhaven that Maggie had never quite made peace with, the way the town gathered for its disasters, the way other towns gathered for their celebrations. Edna Marsh stood on her porch with her arms crossed and her expression carefully arranged into something meant to look like sympathy, but was really closer to relief. Relief that it was Maggie's family and not hers. Relief that the spectacle was happening at a safe distance. The Morris boys leaned on the fence and watched Henry struggle with a heavy trunk, and neither of them moved to help. Reverend Aldrich walked past on the other side of the street close enough that Maggie could have called out to him, and he did not look up. Only old Agnes Tully from 3 doors down came to the fence. Agnes was 70-something, and moved like her bones were made of river clay, and she had known Maggie since Maggie was a girl, and she pressed a cloth-wrapped parcel through the fence rails and said very quietly, "Some cornbread and smoked pork, for the little ones." Maggie took it with both hands. "Thank you, Agnes." "You're a good woman, Maggie Carter," Agnes said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "And this town ought to be ashamed of itself." "The town is fine," Maggie said automatically, because she had been raised to be gracious, because she refused to let Harlan Greaves or Millhaven or any of it turn her into a woman who said the bitter thing, even when the bitter thing was true. She lifted Ruth onto the wagon seat, helped James up. Henry climbed up himself, jaw set, already practicing being the man of this broken family, and Maggie's heart cracked clean down the middle watching him. Clara sat in the back with her arms around the trunk that held Thomas's Bible and her mother's quilts, and she stared straight ahead at nothing. Maggie climbed up last. The wagon seat groaned slightly under her weight, it always did, and she had always felt the slight burn of self-consciousness about it. And today of all days, she did not have the reserves to be above that small cruelty. And she picked up the reins, and she did not look back at the house. She would not give it, or the people watching, the satisfaction of her looking back. She clicked her tongue, and the horse moved forward, and that was that. 11 years. Gone before the sun hit the ridge. She had 43 cents left after Agnes's parcel, and no clear direction. The church ran a charitable house on the edge of town. Reverend Aldrich's charity house, the one he'd walked past without looking up. But Maggie had heard what happened in charity houses. Families got separated. Children got housed in different rooms from their mothers, boys in one wing and girls in another, all of them eating at long tables with strangers and sleeping in rows, and learning that need was something to be managed rather than loved. She would not do that to her children. She would not scatter them. There was no family to turn to. Thomas had been an only child and his parents were dead. Maggie's mother had died 3 years back, and her father had gone to California in 1863 and never written twice. She had no aunts, no cousins close enough to call on, no one in this town who had stepped forward in 8 days to say, "Here, come stay with us, bring the children, we'll figure it out together." No one had said that, not one person. She drove the wagon north because north was out of Millhaven, and out was the only direction that made any sense. She had been driving maybe 20 minutes, the town behind her and the road ahead empty and the late afternoon sun slanting sideways through the Douglas firs, when Henry said, "Mama, where are we actually going?" "I'm working on that," she said. "You don't know, do you?" It wasn't an accusation. It was just Henry being Henry, too perceptive, too direct, too much like his father. "I have some ideas," Maggie said. "What ideas?" "Henry." Her voice was gentle but final. "Let me drive." He subsided. James had fallen asleep against his brother's shoulder, which was the mercy of small children. They could sleep through catastrophe. Ruth was studying a beetle she had found on the wagon bench, with the focused intensity of a natural philosopher. Clara was quiet in the back, which meant Clara was doing what Clara did. When the world became too much, she was going somewhere inside herself, somewhere the trouble couldn't reach her. Maggie drove and thought and tried to construct a plan from nothing, which was what women like her had always done, what women like her had always had to do. She was deep enough in that particular kind of desperate mathematical thinking. $2.14, 3 days of food. If she was careful, the nearest town with a hiring house was 20 miles. She could cook, she could clean, she could take in laundry. She needed somewhere to sleep before any of that she needed when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up behind the wagon, steady and unhurried. She tensed. A woman alone on a road with 4 children in 1878 had reason to tense at hoofbeats. She kept her eyes forward and her hands easy on the reins, and reached slowly with her right hand toward the place under the seat where Thomas's old pistol lived in its leather wrap. She hadn't fired it in years, but she knew how, and the knowing was enough. The horse drew level with the wagon, and then the rider slowed to a walk to match her pace, and Maggie turned her head to look. He was not what she had braced for. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe a year or two past, with the kind of face that weather and silence had assembled into something quiet and unreadable. Not handsome exactly, or not in the practiced way of men who knew they were handsome, but solid with good bones and steady eyes, and the particular stillness of a man who spent most of his hours alone. He wore a plain work coat, trail-worn and honest, and a hat that had seen hard use, and he sat his horse the way men who'd grown up ranching sat horses, like the horse was just another part of him, unremarkable and natural. He looked at her. He looked at the children. He looked at the loaded wagon with the trunk and the quilts and the packed-up life. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just rode alongside her in silence while she watched him from the corner of her eye and kept her right hand close to the pistol. Finally he said, "Ma'am." His voice was low, not loud, not the voice of a man who was used to filling rooms. "Sir," Maggie said carefully. He looked ahead at the road. "You headed somewhere particular?" I am, she said, which was not technically a lie, because she was headed somewhere she just hadn't decided where yet. He seemed to consider this. Road north from here hits open country about 2 miles up. After that, it's 20 miles to Carver's Crossing. That's a hard drive with children in the evening. We'll manage. Yes, ma'am, he said. I expect you will. He didn't say anything else for another quarter mile, just rode alongside her like it was a perfectly ordinary thing, like they were neighbors who'd happened to be heading the same direction, and Maggie could feel Clara watching from the back of the wagon, and Henry watching from beside her, and she kept her own eyes on the road and her expression neutral. Then he said, My name's Ethan Brooks. I've got a ranch about a mile east of here, off the Miller Creek Road. She didn't respond. It's a working spread, he continued, still looking ahead, still in that same low, unhurried voice. Cattle, some horses. I run it alone. A pause. House is bigger than one man needs. Maggie's hands tightened on the reins. I'm not in the habit of accepting charity from strangers, she said. Her voice came out even. Good. Wasn't offering charity, Ethan Brooks said. He glanced at her, then just briefly, just enough for her to see that the eyes were dark and entirely straightforward. No angle in them, nothing hidden as far as she could read. I was thinking more of a business arrangement. What kind of business arrangement? He looked back at the road. I eat bad cooking because I do my own cooking and I'm not good at it. House doesn't get cleaned proper because I don't have time between the stock work. I've got 4 bedrooms sitting empty. He paused again. You've got 4 children who need a roof and a mother who I'd guess can cook and keep a house. Maggie said nothing. Wages, he added. Fair ones. Enough that after a season you'd have options. And what do you get out of it? She said. It was not really a question. It was the thing you said when someone offered you something in this world. You asked what the cost was, because there was always a cost. Decent meals, he said. A clean house. Somebody to make sure the lamp in the front window gets lit at night, because I forget. He said the last part almost to himself, like it was an admission he hadn't entirely planned to make. Place has been too quiet for too long. Henry was staring at the man with unabashed 8-year-old assessment. James was awake now and pressed against Maggie's arm. Clara had gone very still in the back of the wagon, the way Clara went still when she was paying close attention. Maggie drove in silence for another 100 yards. Every sensible instinct she had said no. Said a woman did not follow a strange man to an isolated ranch. Said this was how women disappeared, how children disappeared. Said the risk was incalculable. Said she knew nothing about this man beyond his name and his voice, and the fact that he had ridden up beside her on an empty road. But underneath the sensible instincts was the math. The $2 math. The 20 miles to Carver's Crossing math. The 4 children who needed to eat in the morning math. And underneath even that was something quieter. Something she barely let herself hear. The way he'd said the house had been too quiet for too long. Not as a pitch. Not as a persuasion. As a fact he'd stated without meaning, to the way people sometimes told the truth by accident when they were tired of carrying it alone. I would need to see the arrangement in writing, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, more like respect. That's fair. My children stay together, all 4 of them same wing of the house. Course. I set the schedule for the house. Meals, cleaning, household management. You don't interfere with how I run the domestic side. Wouldn't dream of it. And if at any point I decide the arrangement isn't working, she said, I leave with 2 weeks' wages in my hand and no argument from you. Ethan Brooks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Yes, ma'am. All of that. She looked at him then. Really looked at him the way she hadn't let herself do yet. Looking for the lie. Looking for the angle. Looking for the particular quality of dishonesty that men wore on their faces when they were showing you something other than what they were. She didn't find it. That didn't mean it wasn't there. But she didn't find it. 1 month trial, she said. At the end of the month both parties decide. 1 month, he agreed. She looked back at the road. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were steady. "Your ranch is east of here, you said." "Yes, ma'am. Miller Creek Road." "Show me," Maggie Carter said, "and God help you if this isn't what you say it is." He turned his horse without a word, and she followed him east off the main road, and behind her, she heard Clara exhale slowly and Henry say under his breath, "Mama, are you sure?" And Maggie say back very quietly, "No. But we're going anyway." The Miller Creek Road was rutted and shaded by old-growth fir, the kind of trees that had been standing longer than Oregon had been a state, and the evening light came through them in long golden strips that lay across the road like something from a painting. The ranch appeared at the end of a long straight drive. She could see it from a distance before they arrived, could read it the way she read most things carefully and in full. It was a working spread. That much was plain. Not prosperous looking exactly, not the kind of ranch that announced its wealth, but solid fences and repair outbuildings in decent shape, a barn that was weather-worn but structurally sound. The house itself was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, a wide porch, windows that faced west to catch the afternoon light. Big enough for a family. Which was, she noted, probably why he had built it, or why whoever had built it that way, big enough for a life that had not yet been lived in it. Ethan Brooks dismounted at the fence and held his horse's reins loosely and waited while Maggie climbed down from the wagon. She took her time. She always took her time. She had learned to inhabit her sighs with deliberateness rather than apology. And then he held the gate open and said simply, "Welcome." James had grabbed Maggie's hand the moment she was on the ground. Ruth was on her hip. Henry stood at the wagon wheel looking at the house with the expression of a boy calculating whether he could trust a thing. Clara stood beside him doing the same calculation with considerably more sophistication. "It's big," Henry said. "It is," Ethan agreed. "You live here alone." "I do." "Why?" Henry asked with the devastating directness of 8-year-olds. Ethan looked at the boy for a moment. Then he said, "Haven't had a good reason not to till now." Henry considered this answer with great seriousness. Then he nodded once, as if he'd reached a verdict, and picked up his bag from the wagon and walked toward the porch. Maggie watched her son walk toward that house. This stranger's house, this uncertain shelter, this terrifying and only option, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way she had been doing all day to keep herself level, and she thought 1 month. 1 month, and then she would know. She didn't know yet that 1 month would become 2, and 2 would become a season, and a season would become something she didn't yet have a word for. She didn't know yet that the house which Ethan Brooks had described as quiet for too long would stop being quiet by the end of the first week, filled with Henry's arguments and James's laughter and Ruth's tuneless singing and Clara's careful, watchful questions. She didn't know yet what would grow in that silence, slow and stubborn and real, the way things grow in the West, not gracefully, not easily, but with roots so deep that once they take hold, nothing short of everything can pull them free. She just knew that it was getting dark and her children needed to eat, and inside that house there was a kitchen. So Maggie Carter hitched Ruth higher on her hip, reached back for James's hand, and walked toward the porch of Ethan Brooks's too-quiet house. She didn't look back at the road behind her. She was done looking back. The kitchen was the first battlefield. Maggie found it the morning after they arrived, and found was the right word, because walking into Ethan Brooks's kitchen was less like entering a room and more like discovering the aftermath of a long defeat. The cast-iron skillet had a layer of seasoning on it that had stopped being seasoning somewhere around 1874 and had since become archaeology. The flour bin had weevils. The coffee pot had been boiled so many times without proper cleaning that the inside had developed its own ecosystem. There was a side of salt pork hanging from the ceiling hook that smelled honest enough, and a sack of cornmeal that was still good, and some dried beans, and that was roughly where Ethan Brooks's domestic optimism ended. She stood in the middle of that kitchen in the early gray light of the first morning. Ruth still asleep on her hip because Ruth had woken at 5 and refused to go back down without someone to hold. And she looked at the disaster in front of her and made her decision. The way she made all her decisions quietly, without ceremony, and without waiting for anyone's permission. She put Ruth in the wooden chair by the window with a piece of cold cornbread from Agnes Tully's parcel and went to work. By the time Henry appeared in the doorway rubbing his eyes and trailing his suspenders, the skillet was scrubbed, the floor was swept, the coffee was on, and Maggie had located a dozen eggs in a covered crate near the back door and was deciding what to do with them. "Is that real coffee?" Henry asked. "It is." "Mr. Brooks must have been drinking terrible coffee." "Mr. Brooks was drinking something that thought it was coffee," Maggie agreed. "Hand me that bowl." Henry handed her the bowl without being asked twice which was something, and then leaned against the doorframe watching her crack eggs with the efficient rhythm of a woman who had cooked 10,000 breakfasts and would cook 10,000 more. "Mama," he said, "do you think he's actually all right, Mr. Brooks?" "I think it's too early to know that." "He let us sleep in real beds." "He did. And he didn't ask for anything. He asked for breakfast," Maggie said, "which is what I'm making." Henry was quiet for a moment, chewing on the edge of his thumb, the way he did when he was thinking hard. "Papa used to do that. Just ask for breakfast. Like it was simple." Maggie kept cracking eggs. "Your father was a simple man in the best possible way." "Do you think Mr. Brooks is like Papa?" She paused, just for a beat. Then she said, "I think Mr. Brooks is his own kind of man, and we don't know him well enough yet to compare him to anyone. Now go wake your brother before that coffee gets cold." Ethan came in from the barn at 6:30, with mud on his boots and hay on his coat, and the particular quiet of a man who had spent his first waking hours in the company of animals, and found that perfectly sufficient. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at the table set for the first time in what was clearly a very long time, and then looked at the stove, and then at Maggie, who was sliding eggs onto a plate like this was her kitchen and always had been. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You didn't have to do all this." "The arrangement was meals and housekeeping," Maggie said without turning around. "This is breakfast. Sit down." He sat down. She put the plate in front of him. Eggs, fried, salt pork, cornbread. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he'd forgotten existed. Clara came down the stairs and stopped when she saw him sitting there and said, "Good morning, sir," with the careful politeness of a girl who had been raised right and was applying that raising under conditions of significant uncertainty. Ethan said, "Morning, miss," and Clara sat down across the table from him, and that was the first meal the four children arranged around the table, and Maggie moving between the stove and the table, and Ethan Brooks eating in silence. It was James who broke the silence because James was 6, and 6-year-olds do not respect silence. "Are you a real cowboy?" James asked. Ethan looked at him. "I'm a rancher." "That's not the same as a cowboy." "Cowboys drive cattle, ranchers raise it. Sometimes there's overlap." James considered this with great seriousness. "Do you have a gun?" "James," Maggie said. "It's a fair question," Ethan said. He looked at James. "I do. It stays in the tack room unless I need it. Have you ever shot anyone?" "James." Maggie's voice was quiet but absolute. Ethan looked briefly like he might almost smile, though it didn't quite make it to his face. He said, "Eat your breakfast." And James, to Maggie's considerable surprise, did exactly that. The first week was a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Ethan moved through the house with a careful consciousness of the new geometry of it staying to one side, not interrupting the rhythms Maggie was establishing, leaving for the barn early, and coming in late, and sitting at the far end of the table in the evenings. Like a man who understood, he was a guest in something, even if the deed was in his name. He was scrupulously correct. He said, "Please and thank you." He never raised his voice. He never came near her. Not accidentally, not in passing. He gave her and the children a physical courtesy of space that she noticed, and that quietly unraveled a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She had been afraid in the back of her mind, in the place she didn't admit to, of what a man alone might mean. She had been afraid of that particular kind of arrangement, the one where the terms weren't really what they seemed to be. She watched for it. She watched for the shift in his eyes, the encroachment, the moment where the business arrangement started to slide into something she hadn't agreed to. It didn't come. Day after day, it didn't come, and she filed that information carefully and said nothing. The children adapted faster than she did. Children always did. James had decided within 48 hours that Ethan was the most interesting person he had ever encountered, and pursued him with a 6-year-old's relentless curiosity, appearing at the barn door when Ethan was working, asking questions about horses and cattle and fence posts, and rope accepting whatever single-sentence answers Ethan provided, with the satisfaction of a collector adding to a collection. Ethan never chased him off, never shortened his answers into dismissiveness. Just talked to the boy the way he talked to everyone, plainly, without ornament, like words were valuable enough to spend carefully. Ruth followed James everywhere, including to the barn door, and regarded Ethan from a distance of about 4 feet with the intent evaluation of a very small scientist. She had not yet spoken to him directly. She just watched him. Henry was the complicated one. Henry was 8 and fatherless and male and proud, and he was trying very hard to be something he wasn't old enough to be, and the presence of an adult man on the property unsettled him in a way he didn't have language for. He was polite to Ethan in the stiff, watchful way of someone waiting to be disappointed. He helped without being asked in the evenings, carrying things, holding things, being useful in the pointed way of a boy who wanted to establish that he was not a burden. And Ethan noticed this. Maggie could tell he noticed, but he didn't remark on it, which was exactly the right thing to do. Clara noticed everything and said almost nothing, which meant she was doing her most serious thinking. On the 5th morning, Maggie found her in the kitchen before everyone else, sitting at the table with a cup of water, just sitting. "You should be sleeping," Maggie said. "I was thinking." "About what?" Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. She was 13, and sometimes looked 30, and sometimes looked 9, and this morning was somewhere in between. "He fixed the hinge on the back door," she said. Maggie had noticed that too. The back door had been hanging crooked since they arrived, squeaking and catching every time someone opened it. She'd meant to mention it. She hadn't needed to. "He did," Maggie said. "He didn't say anything about it. He just did it." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Papa used to do things like that. Just fix something without making a fuss about it." Maggie sat down across from her daughter. In the gray early light, Clara looked so much like Thomas that it was sometimes physically painful to look at her. "Your father was good at that," she said. "Do you trust him, Mr. Brooks?" "I'm getting there," Maggie said carefully. "Trust takes longer than 5 days. But you're not scared anymore," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I could tell when you were scared, that first night. You weren't sleeping. I could hear you." She looked at her mother with Thomas's watchful dark eyes. "Last night you slept." Maggie looked at her oldest child, this girl who had been quietly monitoring her mother's fear like a barometer, who had been tracking the weather of this new situation with the precision of a child who had learned early that adults didn't always tell you the truth about how bad things were. She reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. "Last night I slept," she confirmed. The first real crack in the arrangement came at the end of the first week, and it came from outside the ranch. She had driven the wagon into Millhaven on Thursday for supplies. She had a list, and she had Ethan's money for the supplies, and she had Clara with her because Clara was old enough to help carry and old enough to be company, and it was the first time she'd been back in town since the morning they left. She had told herself it wouldn't bother her. She had told herself the opinions of Millhaven were no longer her concern. She was wrong, and she found out how wrong when she walked into Guthrie's general store, and Dorothy Marsh, Edna Marsh's sister-in-law, who was standing at the counter buying ribbon, turned around and looked at her with an expression that started as surprise and landed somewhere considerably less charitable. "Maggie Carter," Dorothy said. "Dorothy," Maggie said pleasantly. She handed her list to old Walt Guthrie behind the counter. "Good morning, Walt." "Morning, Mrs. Carter." Walt was a decent man. He took the list without comment and started moving. "I heard you took up with the Brooks man," Dorothy said to Maggie's back. Maggie turned around slowly. Clara at her elbow had gone very still. "I'm working for Mr. Brooks," Maggie said. "Cooking and housekeeping." Dorothy's expression said she had already formed her opinion and was not planning to have it revised. "Alone out there with him. 4 children." She said it in that tone, that particular Millhaven tone that packaged judgment as concern. "People are talking, Maggie." "People in Millhaven have always talked," Maggie said. "They talked when I married Thomas, and they talked when Thomas died, and apparently they've found something new to talk about. That's all right. People need hobbies." Dorothy's mouth thinned. "I'm just saying what people are saying. You're a woman in your position." "My position," Maggie repeated. "Alone. With children. Moving in with a man you don't know." "I have a written employment contract," Maggie said. "Signed and witnessed. The arrangement is documented, legal, and entirely proper. My children have beds and meals and a roof over their heads, which is considerably more than Millhaven offered when we were standing in the street with our things in a wagon." She looked at Dorothy steadily. "I'll take that ribbon if you're done with it," she said to Walt. "I need about a yard of the blue." Dorothy left without buying her ribbon. Walt cut the blue without comment and added it to the order at his own cost, which was the most any man in Millhaven had done for her, and she thanked him and carried the supplies to the wagon and did not say a word until they were out of town. Then Clara said quietly, "She was horrible. She was scared," Maggie said. "People who talk like that are usually scared of something. Dorothy Marsh is scared that if she admits there was nothing wrong with what we did, she has to admit that Millhaven did something wrong by doing nothing. It's easier to make it about me." Clara thought about this. "That's very generous of you." "It's not generous," Maggie said. "It's just true." She looked ahead at the road. "You don't have to be angry at people for being small, Clara. They're already carrying that." Clara was quiet for a mile. Then she said, "I'm still angry at them." "That's all right too," Maggie said. When they got back to the ranch, Ethan was in the yard repairing a section of fence, and James was sitting on the top rail, talking at him steadily in the way James talked at everyone, which was to say, without particular regard for whether the conversation was bilateral. Ethan was listening, or at least he was present, which with Ethan was sometimes the same thing, and he looked up when the wagon came through the gate. He came over to help unload without being asked. He carried the 2 heaviest sacks in from the wagon, while Maggie and Clara managed the rest, and when everything was in the kitchen, he leaned in the doorway for a moment and said, "How was town?" "Fine," Maggie said. He looked at her in that way he had, not pressing, not pushing, just reading, like he had learned to hear the things underneath the things people said. "Right," he said after a moment. She turned to face him. "Dorothy Marsh says people are talking." He was quiet. "About the arrangement," she said. "About me being out here." "People in Millhaven talk about everything," he said. "I know that. I'm telling you because you should know that it's being said, about your name as well as mine." He looked at her steadily. "I know what's being said. Been said about me before about other things. Doesn't change what's true." "And what's true?" "That there's a written contract," he said, "and 4 children who needed beds and a business arrangement that is exactly what it says it is." He held her gaze without flinching. "That's all the truth I need to stand on." Something settled in Maggie's chest. Not resolution would take longer, but something underneath resolution. Something like the ground. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back and went out to finish the fence. The second week brought something Maggie hadn't expected, which was laughter. Not her own, not yet, but Henry's. Henry, who had been carrying his 8-year-old jaw set tight since the morning they'd packed the wagon, who had been conducting himself with the grimness of a much older person who had been watching Ethan with that evaluating wounded pride wariness. Henry laughed on the 9th day out loud and sudden and real at something Ethan said while they were in the barn. Maggie heard it from the kitchen and went still for a moment, her hands in the bread dough, just listening to the sound of it. Henry's real laugh, the one that sounded like Thomas's laugh, the high, bright, unguarded one, he'd been keeping locked up since his father died. She didn't know what Ethan had said to produce it. She didn't ask. Some things you received without interrogating them. That same evening after dinner, she came around the side of the barn to find Ethan showing Henry something with a length of rope, not talking much, just demonstrating hands moving through the loop and pull of some knot or hitch with practiced patience, and Henry watching with his whole attention, learning the way children learn when they want to learn something, which is the same way they breathe entirely without effort, without even noticing they're doing it. Maggie stood there for a moment in the shadow of the barn, just watching. She told herself she was checking that everything was all right. She told herself it was a practical assessment. She stood there longer than a practical assessment required. Then Ruth appeared from nowhere, as Ruth always appeared, materializing at Maggie's side, without any apparent transit between one place and another, and looked up at her mother, and then out at Ethan and Henry with the rope, and said with great certainty, "He's nice, Mama." "Hush," Maggie said gently. "He fixed the door," Ruth said. "And he let me pet the brown horse." "He let you—" Maggie looked at her 4-year-old. "When did you pet the horse?" "Today," Ruth said, entirely untroubled. "He held me up so I could reach." Maggie turned back to look at Ethan, who was still working with Henry on the rope, and she stood there another minute that had nothing to do with practical assessment at all. The twist came on the 14th day, and it arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Cook. He rode up to the ranch gate on a gray horse in the middle of the afternoon, and Maggie saw him from the kitchen window and knew in the way you know things before you have evidence for them that this was not a social call. He was dressed for town, not dirty enough for ranch work, too deliberate in his presentation, and he sat his horse at the gate with the patience of a man who was being paid to be patient. She went to the door before he knocked. He looked at her with the practiced appraisal of someone taking inventory. "Mrs. Carter." "I don't know you," she said. "Gerald Cook." He tipped his hat with a precision that was entirely performative. "I represent Harlan Greaves at the First Territorial Bank of Millhaven in certain secondary matters." Everything in Maggie went quiet and careful. "What secondary matters?" "The bank became aware that you've taken up residence on the Brooks property," Cook said. "Mr. Greaves wanted to make sure you're aware that the terms of your late husband's debt settlement did include a note regarding future asset recovery." "What note?" Maggie said. Her voice was flat. Cook produced a paper from his coat with the same kind of practiced smoothness that Greaves had produced his papers on the porch 2 weeks ago. In the event that Thomas Carter's estate generated any additional recoverable assets within 18 months of default wages inheritance acquired property, the bank retains a claim of first recovery. Maggie stared at him. "My wages?" "Technically, ma'am, as they relate to the Carter estate settlement." "My wages," she said again, "from work I am doing now with my own hands to feed my children. You're telling me Harlan Greaves has a claim on them?" "It's a legal position the bank is exploring," Cook said carefully. "Get off this property," said a voice behind Maggie. Ethan had come up from the barn without her hearing him. He stood behind her and to the left, and his voice was completely even, not angry, not raised, not threatening, just absolutely certain, the way a fence post is certain. Cook turned his inventory eyes to Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, the bank has no claim against your property." "You're on my land," Ethan said. "Uninvited. To bring papers to a woman who doesn't owe your employer a single additional cent." He walked forward to stand at Maggie's shoulder. "She has a written employment contract. Her wages are her own. Any legal question about that gets answered by her attorney, not by you showing up at my gate." "She has an attorney," Cook said, and there was something in his voice, just a flicker that wasn't professional smoothness. It was recalculation. "She will," Ethan said. "By Monday." Cook looked between them for a moment. Then he tucked the paper back in his coat, with the smoothness still in place, though it required slightly more effort now. "Mr. Greaves will want a formal response." "Mr. Greaves will get one," Ethan said. "Through proper channels. Now ride." Cook rode. Maggie stood on the porch and watched him until he was through the gate and down the road and out of sight, and then she stood there a moment longer, and Ethan stood beside her and said nothing, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the silences of the past 2 weeks. It was the silence of two people who had just stood on the same side of something. "I don't actually have an attorney," she said finally. "I know a man in Carver's Crossing," Ethan said. "Good lawyer, honest. We'll ride out Monday." She turned to look at him. "You'd do that?" He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes. "Greaves foreclosed on a widow 8 days after her husband died," he said. "And now he's sending men to chase her wages. Yeah, Maggie, I'd do that." It was the first time he'd used her name. Not ma'am, not Mrs. Carter. Maggie. She turned back to the road where Cook had disappeared and breathed in slowly. "All right," she said. Monday. That night, after the children were asleep, all 4 of them in the 2 east bedrooms, Henry and James in one, and Clara and Ruth in the other. Ruth already stealing most of the blankets in her sleep, which was a habit she had developed in the womb. Apparently, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and Ethan's ranch ledger open in front of her. He had left it for her to review a few days earlier, suggesting she might want to understand the ranch's finances, since she was technically part of the operation now. She hadn't had time until tonight. She opened it and started reading, and 10 minutes later, she put down her pencil and sat back and stared at the ceiling. The ranch's finances were a mess. Not a catastrophic mess, not a Harlan Greaves kind of mess, not a foreclosure kind of mess, but the quiet, ongoing mess of a man who was very good at ranching and very bad at bookkeeping. Money coming in from cattle sales, money going out for supplies and equipment. None of it recorded with any regularity. Some of it recorded in the margins of other pages, some of it apparently not recorded at all. There were 2 entries for the same feed purchase in different months. There was a supplier credit that had apparently been forgotten. There was, she turned a page and stared an outstanding payment from a cattle buyer in Portland that was 3 months overdue and appeared to have never been followed up on. She pulled the ledger closer and started working. She was still working at midnight when she heard Ethan's boot on the porch and the quiet sound of the door. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, at the ledger, at the notes she'd made in the margins, at the list of discrepancies she'd written on a separate sheet. "You're still up," he said. "You have a payment outstanding from a W. Harmon in Portland," she said. $42, 3 months overdue. Have you contacted him?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I wrote him in March." "Did he write back?" "No." "Then he needs a second letter," Maggie said. "A firmer one. And you have a credit with Morrow's Supply that you haven't claimed. It's right here from November. They overcharged you on the winter feed order and noted it in their own ledger that they owe you a correction." She turned the page. "Also, your feed costs went up 14% between spring and fall last year, and I think you're using the wrong supplier for grain. The Hendersons out on the Camas Road sell at better rates, I know, because Thomas looked into it before." She stopped. The mention of Thomas sat in the air between them for a moment. "Before he died," she said quietly. Ethan pulled out the chair across the table and sat down. Not close, just sat like he was settling into the conversation without making it into anything larger than it was. "You know figures," he said. "I kept Thomas's accounts," Maggie said. "For years. He was a good man and a terrible bookkeeper." The edge of something moved across Ethan's face. Not quite a smile, a softening. Seemed to be a common problem with certain kinds of men. "It does seem that way," she said. She looked at the ledger. "Ethan?" The name came out without her entirely deciding to use it. She noticed that. She kept going. "If I'm going to be running this household properly, I should be keeping these books too. The house accounts and the ranch accounts are connected. I can't manage one without understanding the other." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that reading expression. "You'd want to do that. I'd want to do that right," she said, "which means doing the whole thing." He looked at the ledger, at her notes, at the list of discrepancies she'd laid out in her clean, organized handwriting. "The Portland payment," he said. $42. "Write him tomorrow," she said. "I'll draft the letter if you want." "I'll write it," he said. "But yeah." He looked at her. "Yeah, Maggie. You can keep the books." She nodded and closed the ledger. The lamp flickered between them on the table, and the house was quiet, in the way houses are quiet when everyone in them is sleeping well. And Maggie became aware, sitting there in the lamplight across from this man she had known for 2 weeks, of a strange and tentative feeling that she recognized only distantly because it had been so long since she'd felt it that she'd nearly forgotten what it was. Safety. The first fragile edges of it. Not certainty, not trust, not yet, but the shape of something that might become those things given enough time and enough evenings like this one. Enough moments where the man across the table turned out to be what he appeared to be rather than something else. She didn't say any of that. She said, "Good night, Mr. Brooks." He said, "Good night, Mrs. Carter." And she took the lamp to her room and lay in the dark, listening to her children breathe in the rooms around her, and for the first time in 14 days, she didn't calculate. She didn't add and subtract and measure and plan. She just lay there in the quiet of Ethan Brooks's too-quiet house and let the night be enough. She didn't know yet that 3 days later, a letter would arrive from Gerald Cook, not from Greaves this time, but written in a different hand, a colder one, that would tell her the bank's legal claim on her wages was not an exploration. It was already filed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that stayed with a person, the ordinariness of it. A Tuesday, the kind of day that was supposed to mean nothing, laundry and bread dough and the regular turning of the week, and instead it arrived with Gerald Cook's careful handwriting on the outside and Harlan Greaves's legal malice on the inside. Maggie read it standing at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she set it down flat on the table and put both palms on the wood and breathed. The claim was filed, not threatened. Filed. With the territorial court in Portland 3 days ago before Cook had even ridden out to deliver his preliminary warning. Which meant the warning hadn't been a warning at all. It had been theater designed to make her feel that negotiation was possible when the trap had already been set. Greaves had filed first and sent Cook second, and the sequence of it was deliberate and cold and told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man Harlan Greaves actually was, underneath the thin mustache and the fiduciary language. The claim stated that wages earned by Maggie Carter, formerly of Mill Haven, constituted recoverable assets under the terms of Thomas Carter's default settlement, and that the First Territorial Bank of Mill Haven was entitled to garnish those wages at a rate of 60% until the outstanding debt of $211 was satisfied. 60% of wages she had only just begun to earn, leaving her 40% to feed 4 children and maintain any possibility of a future. She picked the letter up and carried it to the barn. Ethan was working on the back wheel of the supply wagon, crouched down with a wrench and the focused patience of a man who understood that mechanical problems required attention rather than frustration. He looked up when she came in and registered her face before he registered the letter. He stood up. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the stillness in his face that wasn't blankness, but was instead the particular quality of a man absorbing something and deciding what to do about it before he opened his mouth. His jaw was set. His eyes moved through the document once, then went back to the top and moved through it again. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and held it. "He filed 3 days ago," Ethan said, "before Cook came out here." "Yeah." His voice was level. "Cook coming out here was to measure you. See if you'd fold before you found out it was already done." "I know," Maggie said. He looked at her. "You're not folding." "I am not folding," she said, "but I need a lawyer by tomorrow morning, not Monday." "I'll ride to Carver's Crossing today," he said, and he didn't ask her opinion about it, didn't make it a question, just said it the way he said things that were already decided. He handed the letter back to her. "Pack Pendleton's name, he's on Front Street above the feed store. Tell him I sent you." "I'm going with you," Maggie said. He paused. "The children." "Clara can manage for a day. She's managed before." She looked at him steadily. "This is my fight, Ethan. I am going with you." Something moved in his face. Respect, she thought. Or something adjacent to it. Something that took seriously what she was saying, rather than filing it under the category of things women said that could be gently redirected. "All right," he said. "Give me 20 minutes with the horses. Clara, when informed, took command of the household with the efficiency of someone who had been quietly rehearsing for exactly this kind of responsibility. She put her hand out for the list of what the boys needed for lunch, asked 3 specific questions about Ruth's afternoon nap, and said, "Go, Mama, we'll be here." It was so completely like something Thomas would have said, the directness of it, the quiet competence, that Maggie hugged her oldest daughter harder than she meant to, and had to breathe deliberately for a moment before she stepped back. "Lock the gate if anyone you don't know comes up the road," Maggie said. "I know," Clara said, "and don't let James climb the fence again." "I know that too." "Clara, Mama." Her daughter looked at her with Thomas's eyes. "Go fix this." Maggie went. The road to Carver's Crossing was 20 miles of fir and open meadow, and Maggie spent most of it reading the letter again in her head, cataloging every phrase, looking for the weakness in it, because there was always a weakness. Thomas had told her that years ago, when they'd had a dispute with a supplier over a contract. He'd said every legal document has a door. Somebody left unlocked, you just have to find it. She had found the door in that supplier contract, and she intended to find it in this one. She was working through the 4th mental rereading when Ethan said without preamble, "He did this to the Walkers too." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, riding the same way he did everything, with a settled, unhurried attention. "The Walker family," he said. "Caleb Walker died in '74, mining accident out near Jacksonville. His wife Martha had 4 months of payments left on their house note, and Greaves called the whole loan. Said a death constituted a change in the borrower's status that allowed the bank to accelerate the debt." He paused. "Martha Walker had nobody to fight for her. She took her 2 boys to her sister's place in Salem, and I don't know what happened to them after that." Maggie was quiet. "Greaves has done this before," Ethan said. "Not once. Pattern." "You knew this when you rode up to my wagon," Maggie said. "I knew Greaves's reputation," he said. "I didn't know about the wages claim. That's new even for him." She turned this over. "Why are you telling me this now?" He glanced at her. "Because Pendleton needs to know there's a pattern. 1 case is a dispute. 2 cases is a practice. A practice is a different kind of argument in court." She stared at him. "You've thought about this?" "Thought about it since Cook rode away," he said simply. Then, after a moment, "Martha Walker's sister is still in Salem. I know her address." Maggie felt something shift in her chest. Not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had to do with the fact that this man had spent 3 days quietly building the architecture of her defense while she'd been awake at night, worrying alone. She hadn't asked him to. He hadn't told her he was doing it. He had just done it. Fixed the door. Like the hinge. Like the ledger. Like every other thing he'd done in 3 weeks without announcement or expectation of acknowledgement. "Ethan," she said. "Ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am when I'm trying to say something serious." He almost smiled. "All right." "Why are you doing this?" she said. "The real reason, not the business arrangement, not the empty rooms. Why does this matter to you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The horses moved on the road. The firs moved overhead. Then he said, "My mother was a widow for 6 years before she died. Came west with me when I was 12 after my father went. She worked herself to the bone for those 6 years, and every single person in the town we landed in had an opinion about what she should do, and who she should be, and what was proper, and not one of them offered her anything except their opinions." His voice was entirely even. "She deserved better than she got." Maggie looked at him. He was still watching the road. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago," he said. "But yeah, that's the real reason." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was different from all the previous silences, deeper and cleaner and more honest, the kind that only exists between people who have said true things to each other and don't need to fill the space afterward. Robert Pendleton was a small man with large glasses and the organized intelligence of someone who had spent 30 years turning other people's disasters into navigable situations. He read the letter in under 2 minutes asked 6 very precise questions, and then looked at Maggie over his glasses with an expression that was not pity, but was something close to controlled outrage. "The debt settlement agreement," he said. "Do you have a copy?" "They kept the original," Maggie said. "I signed it the day before they took the house. I didn't—" She stopped. She had been about to say she hadn't thought to ask for a copy, but the truth was she hadn't been in any condition to think clearly that day, 8 days out from Thomas's death, standing in the bank with her hands shaking. "I didn't get a copy. We can subpoena it," Pendleton said. He wrote something on his pad. "The wage garnishment claim rests on language in that agreement, specifically whether future income was explicitly included. Standard foreclosure settlements don't typically include earned income clauses. If Greaves added that language himself, there are significant questions about disclosure." He looked at Ethan. "You said there was a prior case." "Martha Walker." "Her sister's in Salem," Ethan said. "Name of Doris Finch. I expect she has documents." Pendleton wrote again. "I'll write to Mrs. Finch today." He looked back at Maggie. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be honest with you. Filing a counter-response will take time. Greaves has a head start. But what you've described, a bank systematically targeting widows with accelerated debt claims and wage garnishment, that is not a small matter, and if I can establish a pattern, the territorial court will look at this very differently than a single dispute." "How long?" Maggie asked. 3 to 4 months to a full hearing. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Pendleton said carefully, "the filed claim exists. Technically, your employer could be served with a garnishment order." Ethan spoke before Maggie could. "Then we restructure the wages," he said. "Pay what we're required to under the order, fight the order in court, and recover the difference when we win." He looked at Maggie. "You're not losing 60% of your wages to Greaves. We'll figure out the household account to cover the gap." Maggie looked at him. "That's not—" "It's a loan," he said. "Against your back wages when the court decides. Pendleton can document it." Pendleton was already writing. "That's a legitimate structure," he said, "and it creates a paper trail that Greaves's attorneys will not enjoy." Maggie sat in the straight-backed chair across from Pendleton's desk and looked at the 2 men who were without apparent effort, without drama, without asking her to be grateful. Building a wall between her and Harlan Greaves. And she felt the particular complicated emotion of a woman who had been taught all her life that her size and her situation made her someone to be helped rather than someone to help, and was discovering that the distinction was less real than she'd been told. She was not being rescued. She was being given tools. That was different. That mattered. "One condition," she said to Pendleton. "I want to see every document, every letter, every filing, every response, before it goes out." Pendleton looked at her over his glasses. "Of course. And if there's anything in that debt settlement agreement that wasn't explained to me before I signed it," she said, "I want to know every word. If such language exists," Pendleton said with a quality of precision that contained a great deal of implicit meaning, "you will be the first person I inform." They rode home in the early evening, the sun going sideways and the shadows long on the road. Maggie was exhausted in the specific way of someone who has spent a day fighting and knows the fight is far from over, and she sat her horse and let the rhythm of it carry her, and didn't try to think or plan or calculate for the first 10 minutes. Then she said, "The household account." "Don't worry about it," Ethan said. "I have to worry about it. I can't let you." "Maggie?" He said her name the same way he always said it, now simple and direct, like it was just a word and not also a small declaration. "The ranch account is fine. I've got the Portland payment coming in, you made sure of that, and the Morrow credit. We're not short." A pause. "Let me help." She looked at the road. "I'm not very good at that." "I know," he said. "I noticed. Thomas used to say I accepted help like it was an insult." "Smart man." "He was," she said quietly. They were quiet for a mile. The light was going golden pink at the edges of everything, the way Oregon evenings went in the fall, that particular reluctant beauty of a sky that didn't want to let go of the day. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "You can ask." "Your husband. How long were you married? 11 years, she said. We married young. I was 19. She looked at the road. He was the first person who ever looked at me and didn't edit me. In his head, most people looked at me and calculated all the things I wasn't before they saw anything I was. She paused. Thomas just saw me. Ethan was quiet. I know what people say about women who look like me, she said, and her voice was even and matter-of-fact, because she had made it even and matter-of-fact years ago, made it that way so the words couldn't do what they used to do to her. I've heard it since I was 10 years old. Too much, too big, too soft. Too much trouble, too much space, too much work to love. She glanced at him briefly. I learned to be capable enough that people looked past the opinions. But you don't ever entirely stop hearing them. Ethan didn't say anything immediately. She had learned enough about him by now to know that silence meant he was selecting something true rather than something easy. Finally, he said, The first time I saw you on that road standing in that wagon, with your back straight and your chin up, and 4 children depending on you, I thought that woman knows exactly who she is. Maggie looked at him. The size of you had nothing to do with that, he said. Still doesn't. She looked away before her expression did something she wasn't prepared to explain. She looked at the road and breathed carefully and said after a moment, Thank you. Not a compliment, he said. Just true. They got back to the ranch as the last of the light was leaving the sky, and Clara was on the porch with Ruth on her hip and the lamp already lit in the window. And Ruth saw Maggie and lunged off Clara's hip toward her with the reckless confidence of a 4-year-old who has never yet fallen and doesn't believe she can. And Maggie caught her daughter and pressed her face into Ruth's soft hair and held on for a moment longer than she meant to. Everything all right? Clara asked, watching her mother's face. We have a lawyer, Maggie said. Everything is moving. Clara exhaled. Good. Where are the boys? Kitchen. Henry's been teaching James to play checkers. It's not going well for James. It never does, Maggie said, and carried Ruth inside, and the house received her the way it always did, now warm and smelling of whatever Clara had put on for supper, and loud with the boys' argument about the rules of checkers, and ordinary in a way that felt every time like a small and specific grace. The 3rd week was when the town began to talk in a different register. It started with Walt Guthrie, who mentioned to the man who came in behind Maggie on Friday that the Brooks Ranch account had settled the outstanding Portland payment and was doing well, which was the kind of financial intelligence that moved through a small town like water through cracked earth, finding every gap. From Walt, it went to the men who drank at Calloway's on Friday evenings. And from those men, it went to their wives, and from the wives, it went everywhere. The way women's information always traveled faster and more thoroughly than men's, because women understood that information was power and had always had to be more strategic about where they put theirs. What the town was saying in various forms, depending on who was doing the saying, was this: Greaves had filed against the Brooks woman, and the Brooks woman had gotten a lawyer, and the lawyer was Robert Pendleton from Carver's Crossing. And Pendleton was reportedly looking into other cases, and there was some talk that the Walkers had been done similarly, and if there was a pattern, Reverend Aldrich came to the ranch on a Thursday. He came alone on foot, which meant he had walked the 1.5 miles from the Miller Creek Road junction, which meant he had something to say that he considered important enough to arrive for under his own power. Maggie saw him coming up the drive and felt something cold and precise settle over her, the feeling she got when she was preparing for a fight she had not started, but was fully prepared to finish. She met him on the porch. He was a tall man with the kind of ascetic face that came from genuine belief rather than performed piety, and she had never disliked him exactly. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had walked past her on the day she lost everything, and those were not the same category, though they were close enough to matter. Reverend, she said. Mrs. Carter. He took off his hat, held it at his side. I owe you an apology. She hadn't expected that. She kept her expression neutral and waited. The day you left Millhaven, he said, I was on the other side of the street. I saw you. I saw the children. I told myself that it was a private matter, a financial matter, not the province of... He stopped, started again. I told myself a number of things that were not true, because the true thing was that I was afraid of making an enemy of Harlan Greaves, and I let that fear make a coward of me. He looked at her steadily. I am sorry, Mrs. Carter. Genuinely. The cold precision of her prepared response softened slightly. She looked at him for a long moment. I appreciate you walking out here to say that, she said finally. That was not a small thing to do. It was considerably smaller than what you needed that day, he said. But it's what I have. She considered him. Come have some coffee, Reverend. He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and Henry, who was doing his letters at the far end, looked up at the Reverend with the appraisal he gave most adult men. Now measuring, guarded, slowly evaluating. Ruth came and stood at the Reverend's elbow and stared at him with scientific interest, and he said hello to her, and she said hello back, which was progress. The church has some resources. Aldrich set his hands around the coffee cup Maggie had given him. For families in difficulty, I should have offered them before. If legal costs are an issue. Robert Pendleton is working on a contingency arrangement, Maggie said. But I'll keep the church's resources in mind. And, Aldrich said, and this was clearly the harder part, the part he'd walked a mile and a half to say, several members of the congregation have expressed there's some feeling in town that what Greaves is doing is not right, that this is not the first time. People are talking Mrs. Carter, not the way Dorothy Marsh was talking. He paused. The other way. Maggie set down her own cup. What do you mean the other way? I mean there are people in Millhaven who would be willing to provide statements, he said, if a lawyer were to ask for them, about what they saw Greaves do, about the Walker case, about the Henderson family in '76. There was a situation there too, a widow, a loan called early. I didn't. He stopped, set his jaw. I didn't speak up then either. I'm trying to do better now. 3 families, not 2. 3. Maggie looked at the Reverend with a clarity that came from somewhere beyond anger, somewhere on the other side of anger that was colder and more useful. 3 families. A practice. And Pendleton had said a practice was a different argument. I need names, she said, and I need you to write to Pendleton today. I came prepared to do exactly that, Aldrich said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I wrote it out this morning. She took it, unfolded it, read it. Then she looked up at him. This mentions 6 people willing to testify. 7 if you count Agnes Tully. Maggie sat for a moment. Then she stood, went to the counter, and stood there with her back to him for a moment that had nothing to do with the coffee she was pretending to tend to, and everything to do with the fact that she needed her face to do a thing it was doing without her permission. She got it under control, turned around. Reverend, she said, this might actually be enough. The twist came on the last day of the 3rd week, and it came from the direction she least expected, not from Greaves, not from the court, not from outside the ranch at all. It came from Henry. He came to her after supper when the other children had gone up, and Ethan had gone out to check the stock, and he stood in the kitchen doorway in the way he stood when he was trying to say something hard, feet planted, chin forward, hands in his pockets. Mama, he said. Sit down, Henry. He sat down across from her. He was 8, and he looked in that moment tremendously young and tremendously old at the same time, which was the thing about grief. It aged you in some directions and kept you small in others. I don't want to leave, he said. She looked at him. What? When all the legal stuff is done. He looked at the table. If we win, and you have your wages, and there's enough money, I don't want to go somewhere else. Maggie was quiet. I know it's not ours, Henry said quickly. I know it's Mr. Brooks' ranch, and we're here because of the arrangement, and I know that's different. But Ruth calls it home now. She told Clara this is her home, and James likes the horses, and I... He stopped. And you, Maggie said gently. He looked up at her, and there was Thomas in his face, so completely and totally Thomas that her heart seized. He's teaching me things, Mama, about the ranch, about how to read the cattle and fix fences, and how to know when the weather's going to turn by looking at the way the horses stand. He pressed his mouth together. Papa was going to teach me those things. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the house. Henry, she said. I know he's not Papa, Henry said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, the way 8-year-old voices cracked when they were carrying too much. I know that. I don't think he's supposed to be. But he searched for the word. He's here. He's here every day, and he doesn't go anywhere, and he fixes things when they break, and he talks to me like I'm... He stopped again, swallowed. Like I'm worth talking to. Maggie reached across the table and put her hand over her son's. You are worth talking to, she said. You have always been worth talking to. I know, he said, and the crack in his voice was worse now. But he says it by how he acts, not just by saying it. She held her son's hand and thought about a man who rode up beside a broken wagon on a road going nowhere and offered rooms he didn't have to offer, and who walked 1.5 miles to apologize and didn't know yet that someone else had already beaten him to it, and who built the architecture of her legal defense quietly in the background, while she thought she was carrying it alone. She thought about Thomas, who had looked at her and seen her all of her before they said a word. She thought about Henry, 8 years old, and fatherless, learning to read cattle and feel weather and trust again. She didn't say any of what she was thinking. She just held her son's hand and said, I'm not planning to go anywhere. Henry looked up. You're not? Not yet, she said. We'll see how things go. She squeezed his hand. 1 month at a time. He nodded, sniffed. Reassembled himself with the dignity of an 8-year-old who had said more than he meant to and was now retreating back into his version of composure. Okay, he said. Okay, that's... He stood up because he was done with the emotional portion of the evening. I'm going to bed. Good night, Henry. He was at the door when he turned back. Mama. He asked me today what I wanted to learn next. On the ranch. He looked at her. I told him I wanted to learn to ride properly. Not just sitting, but actually ride. And he said tomorrow morning before breakfast. He went upstairs before she could respond. She sat in the kitchen alone for a long moment. The lamp flickered. The house settled around her, the way houses settled at night. Small sounds, familiar sounds, the sounds of a structure that was holding. She was still sitting there when Ethan came in from checking the stock, and he stopped in the doorway the way he always stopped to read the room, and whatever he saw in her face made him pause. Everything all right? He said. She looked at him across the kitchen, this quiet, steady man in the doorway of his own house, covered in the honest dust of a day's real work, asking her if she was all right the way someone asked it when they actually wanted to know. Henry tells me you're teaching him to ride tomorrow, she said. Something moved in his face, carefully contained. If that's all right with you. She looked at him for a moment that held more than she was ready to put into words. It's all right with me, she said. He nodded once, said, Good night, Maggie. Good night, she said, and then quietly, before she thought about it enough to stop herself, Ethan. Thank you. He didn't ask what for. He just looked at her with those steady, honest eyes and nodded once more and went down the hall to his room. And Maggie sat in this kitchen of his too-quiet house that was no longer quiet at all, and the letter from Pendleton that would arrive in 4 days and change everything sat somewhere in the distance, waiting to be opened, and she didn't know about it yet, and so she just sat in the lamplight and let the quiet be enough. Pendleton's letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, and it was not what Maggie had been bracing for. She had been bracing for more legal complexity, more delay, more of the grinding procedural patience that Pendleton had warned her about in Carver's Crossing. She had been preparing herself for 3 to 4 months for the long fight for the kind of endurance that required you to put your head down and keep moving without looking at the horizon, because the horizon was too far away to help you. The letter was 4 pages long. She read it at the kitchen table before the children came down, before Ethan came in from the barn in the early gray quiet that had become her private hour. The hour that belonged to nobody but her, the hour when the house held its breath and she could think without managing anyone else's fear at the same time. She read it once, Then she sat back and stared at the ceiling. Then she read it again. Pendleton had written to Doris Finch in Salem. Doris Finch had written back within 48 hours with a packet of documents that her sister Martha Walker had kept the original loan agreement, the acceleration notice, and a letter from Greaves's office that contained language so similar to the language in Maggie's own settlement that Pendleton had underlined sections of both documents side by side, and the underlining told the story more clearly than any argument could. The same phrasing, the same clause structure, the same particular legal construction around future income recovery that no standard foreclosure template contained, which meant Greaves or someone working for him had written it, deliberately, had inserted it, deliberately, had built it into the boilerplate of his foreclosure documents like a trap set in advance. And then Pendleton had written to Reverend Aldrich, who had sent him the names. And Pendleton had written to 3 of those names, and 2 of them had already written back. The Henderson family, a widow named Caroline Henderson, who had lost her house in 1876, 2 years before, Maggie under circumstances so parallel to hers that reading the summary made her stomach drop, had kept every document, every letter, every notice. Caroline Henderson was currently living with her daughter in Eugene, and had stated in writing that she would travel to Portland to testify if required. 3 families, 3 cases, 3 sets of documents with the same constructed language in the same positions. Pendleton's assessment, written in his small, precise hand on the final page, was this. This is no longer a debt dispute. This is a fraud case. I am filing a counter-complaint with the Territorial Court, alleging systematic predatory practice against widowed borrowers and requesting an emergency injunction against the wage garnishment order pending the full hearing. I believe we have sufficient grounds. I believe the court will grant it. I need you to come to Carver's Crossing by Friday. Maggie put the letter down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and sat there in the silence of the early morning and felt something move through her that was bigger than relief and more complicated than hope. Something that felt like the ground shifting, like a thing that had been built wrong for a long time, beginning finally to be taken apart. Ethan came in at 6:30, and she handed him the letter before he got his coat off. He read it standing up. She watched his face move through it, the careful attention, the slight tightening around his eyes at the Walker documentation summary, the stillness at the Henderson case, and then something at the final paragraph that was not quite a smile, but was the most movement his face had produced in 4 weeks of mornings. He looked up. Fraud case. That's what he says. He's right, Ethan said. He set the letter on the table with a deliberateness that was not gentleness, but was its own kind of respect. That language in your settlement, I looked at it again last week. You can't get that construction from a standard document. Somebody wrote it on purpose. You looked at it again last week, Maggie said. I read law books, he said without particular emphasis. Evenings. She stared at him. You've been reading law books in the evenings. Pendleton gave me a couple of references when we were there, he said. I wanted to understand what we were dealing with. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at this man who went out at dawn and worked through the day and came in at dusk, and then in the hours she thought he was sleeping, sat reading law books by lamplight because he wanted to understand what she was dealing with. Who had apparently been doing this for weeks without mentioning it. Why didn't you tell me? She said. He looked at her steadily. You had enough to carry. Ethan. You were managing 4 children and a legal fight and a household and the ranch books, he said. You didn't need one more thing to worry about. I figured if I found something useful, I'd tell you. If I didn't, there was no point in telling you I was looking. He paused. I found something useful. What did you find? He crossed to the shelf where he'd been keeping a stack of papers that she'd assumed were ranch documents and pulled out a slim volume with a folded page inside and opened it to the marked page and set it on the table in front of her. It was a territorial statute. 1871. Property and Debt Recovery Act. Oregon Territory. She read the section he'd underlined with her finger tracking the words, and halfway through the second paragraph she understood what she was reading. Under territorial law, any debt settlement agreement that included provisions not explicitly disclosed to the debtor in plain language at the time of signing was voidable. Not just the undisclosed provision, the entire agreement. If Greaves had inserted the future income recovery clause without specifically explaining it to Maggie before she signed, the whole settlement could be challenged. Not just the wage garnishment, the entire foreclosure. She looked up from the page. The entire foreclosure. If the agreement is voided, Ethan said, the house goes back to pre-default status. The debt still exists, but the original loan terms apply. You'd owe the bank the remaining payments, not the full accelerated balance. He paused. And on the day he foreclosed, you were 7 months in arrears. Not the full loan. 7 months. She stared at him. 7 months, she said slowly, is $2.14 a week. I know what you had in that flour barrel, he said quietly. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the room. Ethan, she said, and her voice was careful, precise, because she was navigating something that required precision. If the court voids the settlement agreement, you'd have options, he said. Real ones, not just the ones that were left after Greaves took everything. She sat with this for a long moment. The children were moving upstairs. She could hear Ruth's morning sounds, the particular pattern of small feet on the floorboards that she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat. She could hear Henry's voice saying something sharp and brief to James, and James's response, which was louder and less brief, and Clara's quieter intervention that settled both of them, her house, her children. Her ordinary morning, which had somehow become something she hadn't dared call by its right name yet. I need to get to Carver's Crossing by Friday, she said. I'll go with you. You don't have to. Maggie. His voice was not sharp, but it was absolute. I'll go with you. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes that had never once in 5 weeks wavered or shifted or shown her anything other than what they said they were showing her. And she thought about Thomas, who had looked at her the same way. Not the same man, not the same eyes, not the same kind of steadiness, but the same essential quality of being exactly as present as he appeared to be, no more and no less, which was the rarest thing she had ever encountered in a person, and the thing she had most missed since the day they put Thomas in the ground. All right, she said. Friday. He nodded, poured himself coffee, sat down at the table like it was any other morning, which it was, and also wasn't, and they drank their coffee in the quiet before the children came down, and said nothing more, because what needed to be said had been said, and what didn't need to be said was better served by the coffee and the lamplight and the particular peace of two people who had stopped pretending they were strangers. The accident happened on Thursday. She heard it from this kitchen, a sound that was wrong before she could name what kind of wrong. It was a crack and a brief shout, and then silence. And silence was the worst part, and she was already moving before the silence finished. Clara heard it too, and met her at the door, and they both ran, and Ruth started crying in the back room, because she'd felt the change in the house's atmosphere, the way small children felt things before they understood them. Ethan was down between the barn and the fence line, where he'd been repairing the top rail down on the ground, with one hand braced and one arm wrong at the shoulder. The kind of wrong that told you everything you needed to know before you got close enough to see the specifics. The fence post had given way. He'd taken the full weight of the rail coming down, and it had caught him at the shoulder and driven him sideways, and he was conscious and trying to get up and doing neither effectively. Don't, Maggie said, and her voice came out with a crispness that stopped him immediately. She was at his side, and her hands were already reading the injury. Not frantically, not with the trembling hands of panic, but with the firm, deliberate touch of a woman who had set 2 broken bones in her life. Thomas's wrist in 1869 and James's collarbone last spring, and understood what a displaced shoulder felt like under her hands. It's not broken, she said. Dislocated. Hold still. I'm fine, he said, which was such a predictable thing for him to say that she almost wanted to laugh. You are not fine, she said. You're sitting in the dirt with your shoulder 3 inches where it shouldn't be. Hold still and let me work. Henry had appeared from somewhere and was standing back at a distance with his face very controlled in the way he controlled it when he was frightened and didn't want to show it. Clara had Ruth, who had stopped crying and was watching Maggie's hands with the same focused attention she gave everything she wanted to understand. "This is going to hurt," Maggie told Ethan. "For about 3 seconds. Then it'll hurt considerably less." He looked at her. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were steady. "You've done this before." Thomas and James. Different circumstances, same mechanics. She repositioned her hands, found her angle, felt the joint, and what it needed. "Breathe in." He breathed in. She said it on the exhale. He made a sound that was short and controlled and involuntary all at once, and then the joint was back where it belonged, and she held pressure on it and felt him breathe. 3 seconds, she said. 2.5, he said through his teeth. "Don't be competitive about it." Something moved in his face that was unmistakably a laugh, short and surprised and real, and she felt it move through her hands, where they held his shoulder, and something in her chest responded to it, some bell tone of a thing that she chose not to examine too closely in the middle of a medical situation. She got him inside and into the chair at the kitchen table, and she cleaned the abrasion along his jaw from the fall and wrapped his shoulder the way it needed wrapping, and he sat through all of it with the patient stillness of a man who understood that arguing with her at this point was not a viable strategy. Clara made coffee. Henry hovered in the doorway doing his version of not hovering, which involved asking a specific functional question every few minutes. "Does he need water? Should I get the blanket from the chest? Do you want me to check on the horses?" Maggie gave him tasks because she understood that Henry's way of managing fear was to be useful, and the tasks helped him breathe. James asked Ethan if it hurt very much, and Ethan said some, and James said his collarbone had hurt a lot when he broke it, and Ethan said he'd heard that, and James said Mama had fixed that too, and Ethan said she was good at it, and James nodded with the solemn authority of personal experience. Ruth climbed into the chair beside Ethan and sat there for the rest of the morning, not talking, not doing anything in particular, just present, keeping him company in the way she kept company, which was entirely by proximity and entirely sufficient. That evening, after she'd made him eat and the children were in bed, she sat in the kitchen while he rested in the chair across from her, his arm in the sling she'd fashioned, and the house was quiet. In the particular way it was quiet late at night, and she looked at him and said without deciding to, "Are you actually all right?" He opened his eyes. "Getting there. You scared me," she said. She said it matter-of-factly because it was a fact. When I heard the sound and then the silence, that particular silence. He looked at her. "I know that silence," he said quietly. She did not ask him how he knew it. There were things about Ethan Brooks she was still learning in the careful, gradual way you learn a landscape not all at once, but piece by piece the particular shape of each hill and valley, revealing itself as you move through it. "Ethan," she said, "what happened before you were here alone?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited because she had learned that he would answer if she gave him the space to do it in his own time. "There was a woman," he said finally. 8 years ago. We were engaged. She was from a family in Carver's Crossing. Good family. Good people." He looked at the table. "She left. Not badly, not cruelly. She just decided the life I was building out here wasn't the life she wanted, and she was honest about it, and she left." A pause. "I don't blame her. I understood it. But after that I just stopped trying to build something for 2 people. Built for one. Got good at being one." Maggie was quiet. "The house was supposed to be bigger than one person," he said. "I built it when I thought there was a reason to build it big. After she left, I just rattled around in it." He glanced up at her. "You asked me once why I live here alone. That's the real reason, all of it." She sat with that for a moment, with the shape of it, the particular loneliness of a man who had built something for a life that didn't come, and had spent 8 years living in the echo of it. "The night you rode up beside my wagon," she said slowly. "You were coming from town." "I was." "Had you heard about the foreclosure?" He met her eyes. "I'd heard. I'd been at Guthrie's when Greaves's man posted the notice that morning." He paused. "I didn't plan to do anything about it. Wasn't my business. I rode out, told myself it wasn't my business, rode about 3 miles. He looked at his coffee cup, turned around. Maggie stared at him. You rode 3 miles and turned around. Couldn't stop thinking about the children, he said. Couldn't stop thinking about a family on the road with nowhere to go. He looked up at her. Told myself it was just the practical thing. Told myself it was just business. Was it? She said. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had accumulated over 5 weeks of mornings and evenings and meals and crises and ledgers and letters, and the slow, careful business of two people learning to trust what they saw in each other. No, he said. It wasn't just business. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, You should sleep. We have Carver's Crossing tomorrow. Maggie? Sleep, Ethan, she said gently. We'll talk. There's time. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name, something between want and patience, something between saying it and understanding why this wasn't the moment, something that understood her enough to wait. He nodded once and stood carefully and went down the hall. She sat at the table for a long time after, alone with the lamp and the quiet house and her own heartbeat, which was doing something it had not done in a long time, and which she was not entirely sure what to do with. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound outside. Not an animal sound, not the ordinary sounds of a ranch at night, a footstep on the drive, deliberate, slow. She went to the window. The night was dark enough that she couldn't see far, but she could see a shape at the gate, and the shape was a man, and he was looking at the house, and he was not moving toward it, just standing there, watching the lit window. Her hand went to the shelf beside the door where Ethan kept his pistol. She stopped herself, breathed. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Who's there? She said clearly. The shape at the gate was still for a moment. Then it moved into the edge of the lamplight from the window, and she saw the face, and she recognized it, and what she felt was not fear, but something colder and more specific. It was Gerald Cook. He wasn't wearing his town clothes. He was wearing trail clothes, and there was mud on his boots, and he looked like a man who had ridden hard and arrived at a place he'd been thinking about coming to for some time. Mrs. Carter, he said. His voice was different tonight, not smooth. Something scraped away underneath the smooth. Mr. Cook, she said, it's 10 o'clock at night. You're standing at a closed gate. Whatever you have to say, you can say it through Pendleton. Pendleton, he said, and the name came out with an edge on it. Yes, Pendleton's made things complicated. That's rather the point of a lawyer, she said. He took a step toward the gate. She held her ground on the porch. Mrs. Carter, I came to tell you something. Not on behalf of Greaves. On my own account. She waited. He knows about the statute, Cook said. The 1871 Act. He has a lawyer in Portland who flagged it 2 days ago. He's moving to have the court record amended. He's going to claim the clause was disclosed verbally, even if it wasn't written in plain language. He'll say his clerk read it to you. He'll produce the clerk to say it. Maggie's blood went cold. He'll fabricate testimony. He'll produce testimony, Cook said carefully. Whether it's fabricated is a matter of what you can prove. She stared at him. Why are you telling me this? He looked at the gate between them for a moment. Then he looked up at her. Because Martha Walker had a boy, he said. 8 years old, same age as yours, when they took that house. His voice was completely flat. I was there. I was Greaves's man then too. I drove the wagon that moved their things to the road. A pause. I've thought about that boy a great deal over the years. Silence. If Pendleton files before Monday, Cook said, before Greaves's amended record goes in, the emergency injunction takes precedence and the verbal disclosure argument becomes a response rather than a foundation. Timing matters. He turned and walked back down the drive, and in 30 seconds the dark had swallowed him. Maggie stood on the porch in the cold October night, and her mind was already moving. Pendleton. Friday was tomorrow. First thing they had to be there. First thing, the filing window, the timing. Ethan needed to be well enough to ride. She went back inside, went directly to Ethan's room, knocked. "I'm awake," he said immediately. She opened the door. He was sitting up, which told her he hadn't actually been sleeping. "We need to leave for Carver's Crossing tonight," she said. "Right now. Can you ride?" He was already reaching for his boots. "What happened?" She told him in 2 minutes, standing in the doorway of his room, laying it out the way she laid out the ledger precisely without waste, every number in its column. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "If we ride now, we get to Pendleton's house by midnight. He'll open the door." "You're sure?" "He told me once that a lawyer who doesn't open his door at midnight for a client whose case is moving doesn't deserve the client," Ethan said. He stood up and reached for his coat with his good arm. "Clara can manage the children till morning." "Clara can manage anything," Maggie said. She went to Clara's room and woke her daughter with a hand on her shoulder and 3 quiet sentences, and Clara sat up and looked at her mother in the dark with those dark, watchful eyes and said, "Go, we'll be here." They rode through the dark of the Oregon night on a road that Ethan knew well enough to follow without full light, and Maggie rode beside him, and they didn't talk much because the horses needed attention on the dark road, and because what there was to say would keep. And because sometimes the most companionable thing 2 people can do is simply move through the dark together, each one trusting the other to stay on the road. They got to Pendleton's house at 15 minutes to midnight. He opened the door in his nightclothes, took one look at their faces and said, "Come in," and had the lamp lit before they were fully through the door. Maggie told him what Cook had said. Pendleton listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, with the stillness of a man who was already 3 steps ahead. When she finished, he was quiet for 5 seconds. Then he went to his desk. "I can file the injunction request tonight," he said. "I have a contact with the overnight court clerk in Portland. It can be on the docket before Greaves's amendment." He was already writing. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to write a sworn statement, right now. Everything Cook said. Every word." "I know exactly what he said," Maggie told him. "I don't doubt it," Pendleton said, and pushed paper and a pen across the desk to her. She wrote for 40 minutes. Ethan sat in the chair beside her in his sling, awake and present, and saying nothing, and she felt his presence beside her. The way you feel the warmth of something substantial on a cold night, not intrusively, not demandingly, just there. Solid. Certain. She finished the statement and signed it, and pushed it back to Pendleton, who read it and nodded once and said, "This is enough." "Will it work?" she said. He looked at her over his glasses. "Greaves built this case assuming you had no resources and no one in your corner," he said. "He was wrong on both counts." He picked up his pen again. "I'll have the filing sent by first rider to Portland. If the clerk is where he says he'll be, it's on the docket by 6 in the morning. Maggie sat back in the chair. The candle on Pendleton's desk flickered in a draft from somewhere and steadied again the way candles did, the way everything did, eventually if you gave it enough time and enough reason. Ethan looked at her from the chair beside her. His shoulder was hurting. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight compensation in how he held himself, but his eyes were clear and steady and entirely focused on her face. "You all right?" he said quietly. She thought about this question. She thought about who had asked it, and how many times, and what her answer had been, and what the true answer was now sitting in a lawyer's office at midnight with a sworn statement in front of her, and a case that had shifted from impossible to possible in the space of one evening. "Yes," she said, and it was the most honest she had been in answer to that question since Thomas died. "I actually am." Something settled in his face. Then, not relief exactly, but the loosening of something that had been held careful for a long time, something that recognized the answer and what it meant beyond the words, something that said good and held that word in its entirety. Pendleton was still writing. Outside, the Oregon night was doing what Oregon nights did in October, cold and clear and indifferent to the small human urgencies happening inside the lit window. The same sky over Millhaven and Carver's Crossing, and the Brooks Ranch, where 4 children were sleeping under quilts that Maggie had carried in a wagon 3 weeks ago when she still thought she had nowhere to go. She thought about Henry learning to ride in the mornings, Ruth sitting beside Ethan in the kitchen chair, Clara with Thomas's eyes and Thomas's steadiness and her own particular brand of 17 going on 30 competence. James, who had asked Ethan if it hurt very much and accepted the answer without drama, which was the best kind of acceptance. She thought about a man who rode 3 miles and turned around. She picked up her pen and signed the second document Pendleton pushed in front of her, and the signature went down clean and dark and entirely certain. Pendleton's rider left for Portland at 4 in the morning. Maggie knew this because she was awake when he left. She had not slept, could not sleep, had sat in the chair in Pendleton's front room while Ethan dozed in the chair beside her, with his bad shoulder braced against the armrest and his hat over his eyes, and she had listened to the sound of the rider's horse on the road and tracked it until the hoofbeats dissolved into the dark, carrying her sworn statement and Pendleton's injunction filing and everything she had built over 5 weeks of fighting toward a court clerk in Portland who would either be where Pendleton said he'd be or wouldn't, and on that single contingency, the entire shape of what came next would turn. She sat in the dark, and she did not pray exactly because she had spent too much of the last 2 months in conversation with a God who had taken Thomas and given her Harlan Greaves, and that particular relationship required some renegotiation. But she held the quiet in both hands, and she breathed steadily, and she waited, which was the only thing left to do. Ethan woke at 5. He didn't make a production of it, just lifted the hat from his face and looked at her in the near dark and said, "You didn't sleep." "No." "You should have woken me." "You needed the rest. Your shoulder needed the rest." He looked at her with an expression that said he had several responses to that, and was selecting the one that would not start an argument at 5 in the morning in a lawyer's front room. What he said was, "Is there coffee in this house?" Pendleton appeared from the back of the house 15 minutes later fully dressed, which told Maggie he hadn't slept either, and he had coffee and a telegram form in his hand, and he looked like a man who had already had the best piece of news he'd gotten in a month and was working out how to deliver it. "The clerk was there," he said. Maggie stood up. "The filing is on the docket as of 5:42 this morning," Pendleton said. "The emergency injunction request is formally entered. Greaves's attorneys cannot file their amended record until the court rules on our injunction, and a ruling on an emergency injunction takes precedence." He set the telegram on the table. "We stopped him." The words landed in Maggie's chest like something physical. She put one hand on the back of the chair and breathed. "For now," Pendleton said, "because he was an honest man, and honest men qualified their victories. The injunction hearing is in 3 weeks, in Portland. We need to be there, and we need to be prepared, and Greaves will have his attorneys, and they will be very good attorneys because Greaves can afford very good attorneys." He looked at her over his glasses. "But we have 3 cases, 7 witnesses, a pattern of practice, and a statute that says what it says, regardless of what any clerk claims," he read aloud. He paused. "I've been practicing law for 30 years. I know the difference between a case and a strong case." "Which is this?" Maggie said. "This," Pendleton said, "is a strong case." She nodded once. She looked at Ethan, who was looking at her with that particular expression she had come to read as his version of relief contained quiet, expressed entirely through the settling of something in his eyes, rather than anything as demonstrative as a change in posture. He gave her the smallest nod. She turned back to Pendleton. "Tell me everything I need to know about the hearing," she said. "Every detail. I want to understand exactly what happens in that room." Pendleton sat down, opened his casebook, and began. They rode home in the early morning light, and the world looked the way it looked after a crisis that had moved from acute to manageable. The same road, the same firs, the same October sky, but the quality of light slightly different, the way the air smells different after a storm has broken. Maggie rode and let herself feel for the first time in weeks something that wasn't entirely made of tension. "Pendleton thinks we'll win," she said. "Pendleton's a careful man," Ethan said. "He doesn't say things like that unless he means them. Greaves will fight it." "He will." Ethan agreed. Right up until he can't. She looked at the road ahead. If the settlement is voided, she said carefully, the way she said things she'd been thinking about for a long time, and was finally ready to say aloud, and the original loan terms apply the 7 months of arrears, I could pay that, in a few months with my wages saved. She paused. I could get the house back. Ethan said nothing. I could take the children back to Millhaven, she said. Back to Thomas's house. That was always the plan, fight Greaves, get back on our feet, rebuild what we had. She kept her eyes on the road. That's what I told myself when I agreed to your arrangement. 1 month, get stable, get legal protection, get back to what we knew. Still nothing from him. She could feel his attention beside her, complete and steady, and giving her all the room she needed to finish the thought. The thing is, she said, I'm not sure what we had is what I want anymore. The road curved, and the morning light came through the firs at a long angle, and Maggie looked at it and thought about Thomas's house, which had been built with Thomas's hands and held Thomas's memory in every board of it, and which had been the right place for the life she'd been living, but was not. She understood now the right place for the life she was becoming. Henry doesn't want to leave, she said. Ruth calls the ranch home. Clara hasn't said it, but I can see it in how she moves through that kitchen, like she belongs in it. She exhaled. And She stopped, looked at her hands on the reins. Maggie, Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. I know what I want, she said. I've known for a while. I just wasn't sure if I had the right to want it. Why wouldn't you have the right? She looked at him then, at his face in the morning light open in the way it was rarely open, all the careful containment of him set aside for once, just looking at her the way she had been looking at him for weeks without entirely admitting to herself what she was doing. Because I came to you with nothing, she said. 4 children and $2.14 and a broken arrangement with a bank. That's not exactly an equal footing to start something from. Equal footing, he repeated. He said it like he was turning it over and looking at the underside of it and finding the premise wanting. Maggie, you walked into my house, and in 3 weeks you fixed what I'd spent 8 years making worse. You kept books I hadn't been keeping. You wrote letters I hadn't been writing. You found a statute my own lawyer didn't find. He paused. You set my shoulder. That's not... You came with everything, he said. I was the one who had nothing. I had a house that was too big and too quiet, and I'd talked myself into believing that was all right. He held her gaze with a directness that left no room for either of them to look away. You changed that. You and those 4 kids changed that. And I would like... He stopped, steadied, started again. I would like for that to be permanent, if you're willing, if that's what you want. The horses moved on the road. The morning held its breath. It's what I want, Maggie said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Just for a moment. Just to say that it was real, that they were both here, that this was not a thing that was going to dissolve when she looked at it directly. Then he let go because they were on horseback on a road, and practicality was part of who both of them were, and the letting go was as meaningful as the taking. One condition, she said. Name it. We go to Portland together, she said. We walk into that hearing together, and when it's done, whatever the outcome, we face it together. That was already the plan, he said. I know, she said. I needed to say it. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was not empty, but was entirely full, the good kind of full, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it, because everything that needs to be there already is. The 3 weeks between Pendleton's filing and the Portland hearing were the strangest 3 weeks of Maggie's life, stranger in their way than the first weeks at the ranch, because those weeks had been defined by crisis, and this was defined by waiting, and waiting had its own particular quality of tension, like a rope pulled taut and held. She cooked. She kept the books. She wrote 3 more letters for Pendleton, carefully worded, factual, building the narrative of the pattern that he needed to present to the court. Reverend Aldrich came twice with additional names, additional statements, additional pieces of the picture that Greaves had apparently been building for a decade, Each widow, a small careful crime. Each foreclosure conducted just inside the edge of legal. Each wage claim filed against women who had no means to fight it. Until now. Caroline Henderson wrote from Eugene, and her letter arrived on a Thursday, and Maggie read it at the kitchen table, and then read it aloud to Ethan, because it was the kind of letter that needed to be read aloud. Caroline Henderson was 44 years old, and had spent 2 years living in her daughter's spare room after Greaves took her house, and she wrote, "I used to think I was foolish for not fighting harder. I know now that I didn't have the tools or the people or the luck that you seem to have found, Mrs. Carter. Fight hard enough for both of us." Maggie folded that letter and kept it in her apron pocket for the rest of the week. Henry was learning to ride properly now. Ethan worked with him every morning before breakfast, patient and specific, correcting small things without making the corrections into corrections, which was a particular teaching skill that Henry responded to better than he responded to most instruction. Maggie watched from the kitchen window on the mornings she was inside and on the mornings she was outside. She watched from the fence, and what she saw was a boy learning something that would belong to him for the rest of his life. From a man who understood that teaching was a form of respect. Ruth had begun calling him Ethan, not Mr. Brooks, not Sir. Ethan, directly and without ceremony, the way 4-year-olds named things that belonged to their world. He answered to it without comment, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about where he had landed on the question of these children and what they were to him. James had decided that Ethan was his primary source of information about all things related to ranching weather horses and the natural world, and pursued this education with the intensity of a scholar who has discovered his field. Ethan fielded the questions with the same patient economy he applied to everything, and occasionally, rarely but genuinely said, "I don't know, let's find out," which was the best possible answer, and James received it as such. Clara was the last to give ground, which was right, because Clara was the oldest and the most Thomas-like in her careful evaluation of people, and Maggie did not push it. She watched her daughter watch Ethan with those dark, measuring eyes, watched her note the fence mending, and the patient teaching, and the midnight law books, and the way he stood beside Maggie on the porch when Cook came to the gate, watched her calculate. On the second week, Clara asked Ethan to show her how to read a cattle ledger. Not because she needed to know, she was 13, there was no urgency, but because she had decided to know which was different and completely Clara. He showed her. He sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon and went through the ledger page by page, explaining what each entry meant and why it mattered, and what you could read in the pattern of numbers if you knew what you were looking for. Clara asked 12 specific questions, all of them good questions. He answered every one. That evening, Clara said to Maggie very quietly while they were washing the supper dishes, "He's patient." "He is," Maggie agreed. "Not performing patient, actually patient." "There's a difference," Maggie said. "Papa was actually patient too," Clara said. And then she was quiet for a moment, her hands in the soapy water, and Maggie let the quiet be what it needed to be. Then Clara said, "I think Papa would have liked him." Maggie kept washing. "I think so too," she said. Clara picked up a dish and dried it. "Okay," she said, which was Clara's way of closing a question she'd been sitting with for a long time. The way you close a book you've finished, not with drama, but with a deliberate finality that said, "I've read this. I know what it says. We can move forward." "Okay," Maggie said. The Portland hearing was on a Tuesday, which was still the kind of day that was supposed to mean nothing, and which would turn out to mean everything, and which Maggie would remember for the rest of her life with the particular clarity that extreme moments leave in the memory, not every detail, but the emotional architecture of it, precise and indelible. They took the train. Pendleton had arranged it, him and Maggie and Ethan and Caroline Henderson, who had traveled from Eugene to be there, and a woman named Grace Sutter, who was the daughter of the third family. Greaves had targeted, whose mother had died 2 years earlier, and who was there to speak for the dead. Reverend Aldrich had submitted his written statement. Doris Finch had submitted Martha Walker's documents. 7 witnesses, 3 cases, 1 pattern. Greaves was there with 2 attorneys from Portland, both of them polished and expensive, and carrying the particular confidence of men who were accustomed to winning on credentials before arguments even began. Greaves himself sat behind them in a good suit and looked at Maggie when she came into the room with the expression she remembered from the porch, the cataloging look, the dismissing look, the look that put her in a category and filed her there. She looked back at him and did not look away. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Pendleton presented his case with the methodical clarity of a man who had spent 3 weeks building something airtight and was now displaying it piece by piece for the court's inspection. The parallel language in the 3 settlement documents. The statute. The timeline of filings that demonstrated Greaves had filed Maggie's wage garnishment before Cook delivered the warning, proving the warning was theater. Caroline Henderson's testimony, delivered in a voice that shook slightly at the start and steadied as she went, describing the morning her house was taken, and the language Greaves's clerk had read aloud from the agreement language that did not, she stated clearly, and under oath, include any mention of future wage recovery. Greaves's attorneys were good. They were very good. They challenged the statute's application. They challenged the parallel language interpretation. They produced their clerk, who stated in a clear, flat voice that he had read the relevant clause aloud to each borrower before signing. They were building a wall, and the wall was well constructed, and Maggie sat in the gallery beside Ethan and felt the hearing move back and forth like a tide, and did not let her face show what the movement was doing to her. Then Pendleton stood up for his final argument, and he said very quietly to the judge, "Your Honor, I would like to introduce one additional piece of evidence that was not included in the original filing." Greaves's attorney said, "Objection. Evidence not disclosed." "It was disclosed this morning," Pendleton said. "The defense received the copy at 8 a.m. I have the delivery record." The judge looked at the delivery record, looked at the document Pendleton produced, said, "Proceed." It was Gerald Cook's sworn statement, written and signed and notarized, delivered to Pendleton's office by Cook himself on the Saturday before the hearing. A full accounting of his role in 3 foreclosure proceedings. The specific instructions Greaves had given him regarding the language to use, and more importantly, the language not to explain. The instruction given to the clerk by Greaves personally to read the document briskly so borrowers would not stop to ask questions about specific clauses. A detail so specific and so damning that the silence in the courtroom after Pendleton read it aloud was the loudest silence Maggie had ever heard. Ethan's hand found hers under the table. She held on. Greaves's attorneys asked for a recess. The judge gave them 10 minutes. They came back, and their posture had changed, and Maggie recognized the change because she had read posture all her life, had read rooms and bodies, and the things people communicated without intending to, and what Greaves's attorneys were communicating now was that the wall they had built had a door in it, and Pendleton had just found the key. The judge ruled on the injunction that afternoon. The wage garnishment was suspended pending the full fraud investigation. The original debt settlement was placed under judicial review pending the disclosure findings. And the territorial court formally referred the case to the Portland District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential systematic fraud against widowed borrowers in the Millhaven District. Harlan Greaves left the courthouse between his attorneys with the particular rigid control of a man who understood that the world he had operated in for a decade had just shifted permanently on its axis. Maggie stood on the courthouse steps in the October air, and Pendleton shook her hand and said, "The investigation will take time, but the garnishment is stopped, and the settlement review means the House question stays open, and when the fraud case is fully established." He paused. "You'll have options, Mrs. Carter, real ones." "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You built this case," he said. "I just filed the papers." Caroline Henderson embraced her before she left a brief, strong hug from a woman who had waited 2 years for this moment and received it in the middle of someone else's fight, which was the way justice sometimes arrived late and by accident and through other people's courage. Grace Sutter squeezed her hand and said, "My mother would have been glad," and Maggie held that with both hands. On the train back, Ethan said nothing for a long time. He sat beside her and looked out the window and let the day settle around them, the way you let a long ride settle when you finally stop feeling the distance in your bones and being glad you made it. Then he said, "What do you want to do about the house?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for 3 weeks, turning it in her hands at night, the way you turn a decision that has implications in all directions. The house in Millhaven, where Thomas's handwriting was on the inside cover of the Bible. The house where the children had learned to walk and talk and become who they were. Thomas's house built with Thomas's hands. "I want to sell it," she said. He looked at her. "If the settlement is voided and the debt reverts to original terms, I can pay off the remaining arrears and take clear title," she said. "And then I want to sell it. Fairly for what it's worth. Not in an emergency, not at a loss, but at a fair price." She looked at her hands. "Thomas built it. It was the right house for the life we had. But that life is finished, and the house should belong to someone who needs it the way we needed it when we built it." Ethan was quiet. "The money from the sale," she said, "I want to use to buy into the ranch. As a proper partner, not an employee, not a housekeeping arrangement." She met his eyes. "Equal footing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I told you that wasn't a condition." "I know you did," she said. "It's my condition. I need it to be that." He understood that. She could see him understand it, the specific dignity of it, the way it mattered to her, not to come as a rescued thing, but as a person who brought her full self to whatever this was becoming. He nodded once, slow and certain. "Equal footing," he said. "Deal." They were married in December. Not in Millhaven, because Millhaven had had its chance and had walked past on the other side of the street. They married in Carver's Crossing, in the office of the Justice of the Peace with Pendleton as witness, and the children arranged in their best clothes in the small room, Henry in his stiff collar, looking simultaneously proud and pained, James, having secured a piece of hard candy from somewhere, and consuming it with discreet dedication throughout the ceremony. Clara, standing with her hands folded and her eyes bright in the particular way they got when she was feeling something large and not going to cry about it, and Ruth, who had been informed that this was a very important and serious occasion and had responded to this information by wearing her rag doll on her head like a hat. When the justice asked if there were any words either of them wanted to say, Maggie had prepared something a few lines careful and considered about gratitude and new beginnings and the unexpected grace of second chances. She looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with the expression she had first noticed on the road, steady, direct, entirely present, containing more than it showed. She looked at her children. These 4 people who were the center of her world, and who had over the past 3 months reorganized themselves around this man with the organic certainty of things that grow toward light. She put her prepared words away. "You rode 3 miles and turned around," she said. He almost smiled. "I did. I've been grateful for that every day since." He looked at her and said simply, "So have I." The justice pronounced them married, and Ruth threw her rag doll in the air by way of celebration, which was not traditional, but was entirely right. They went home in the wagon in the winter light, all 6 of them, Ruth asleep against Ethan's arm before they were half a mile out, James conducting a detailed monologue about the properties of hard candy that no one had solicited, Henry sitting straight and quiet beside Maggie, with something on his face that was peace, the real kind, the earned kind. Clara sat in the back and watched the road unfold behind them, and said nothing, which meant she was exactly where she wanted to be. Spring came to the ranch the way it always came to that part of Oregon, slowly, and then all at once, the way important things came. The land greening overnight, and the stock restless with the energy of it, and the mornings arriving earlier, and staying longer, generous, and unhurried. The ranch accounts were healthy. The Portland payment had been followed by 2 more. The Morrow credit had been claimed and applied. Maggie had found 2 additional supplier inefficiencies in the first quarter and corrected both, and the savings had gone into a fund she and Ethan had established for the expansion. They were planning more grazing land to the east, a second barn that Henry had already submitted design opinions on, more cattle. The fraud investigation was ongoing. 3 additional families had come forward after the hearing drawn by the news that had moved through Millhaven and the surrounding territory, the way water moved through the landscape, finding every crack, filling every low place. Greaves had hired new lawyers and was contesting the investigation with the energy of a man who understood what was at stake. Pendleton was patient. Pendleton was always patient. The house in Millhaven sold in February to a young couple from Portland. A mill worker and his wife just married, looking exactly as Maggie and Thomas had looked in 1867, full of the hopeful practicality of people beginning something. She had shaken their hands and wished them well and meant it, and she had not cried until she was back in the wagon and down the road and sure no one from Millhaven was watching. Ethan had been beside her and had said nothing and had not pretended the moment wasn't what it was, which was exactly right. She had cried for 10 minutes. Then she had dried her face and looked at the road ahead and breathed in the cold February air and let Thomas be in the past where he lived, now beloved and irreplaceable, and finished the way a book was finished when you loved it permanently. Part of you, permanently complete, no longer something you were still in the middle of. In April, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Ethan in the kitchen before the children woke in the gray early morning that had always been her private hour, sitting across the table from him with coffee between them, and she said it simply because with him, there was no other way to say things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and the look on his face was something she had never seen there before, something cracked open in the best way, something that had been waiting for room to exist. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm more than all right," she said. He squeezed her hand and held it, and they sat in the quiet kitchen in the early morning light, and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else to say that the held hand didn't already contain. Henry, when told, said, "I'm going to have to help with the baby, aren't I?" in the tone of someone accepting a significant additional responsibility, which he then proceeded to take seriously, in the characteristically Henry way, researching, preparing, asking specific questions of anyone who would answer them. James said, "Will it be a boy?" and when told there was no way to know yet, accepted this uncertainty with equanimity, and went back to whatever he was doing. Ruth said, "I'll teach it things," and no one doubted that she would. Clara cried briefly and completely, and then straightened her back and said, "We're going to need more quilts," and started planning. The baby was born in November, a girl healthy and loud, and possessed from her first hour of a quality of absolute presence that made everyone in the room look at her and understand that this was a person who had arrived with opinions. They named her Margaret after Maggie's mother, who had died before she could see any of this, and who Maggie thought of with the bittersweet gratitude you felt toward the people whose absence made their presence more precisely known. But they called her Maggie from the start, because the house had room for 2 Maggies, and the older one had earned the right to share her name. Years later, when people in Carver's Crossing or Millhaven or any of the surrounding territory asked about the Brooks Ranch, what they described was not the land or the cattle or the steady, modest prosperity of a well-run operation. What they described was the feeling of the place, the sense arriving at the gate of something organized and warm and fully inhabited, of a house that knew it was a home. They described the sound of children's voices, which were always there in some combination, Henry's increasingly adult authority, and James's irrepressible commentary, and Ruth's patient instruction of whatever younger sibling was nearest, and little Maggie's opinions rendered at volume. They described the woman who kept the accounts and the books, and somehow also the hearts of everyone on the property who could set a shoulder and draft a legal letter, and make biscuits that people drove 20 miles to eat, and who looked at you when she looked at you with the kind of attention that made you feel entirely seen. They described the man who moved through the days with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped being surprised by his own happiness, who had been waiting for years for the right reason to fill the rooms he'd built too big, and had one day ridden 3 miles and turned around and found it standing in the road. And sometimes when they had told the story in full, the foreclosure and the wagon and the empty rooms, and the fight, and the hearing, and the marriage, and everything that came after, someone would ask Maggie how it felt looking back. How it felt to go from the street to here, from $2.14 to this, from a widow with nothing to the woman she had become. She would look at whoever was asking, and then she would look at the house at the lit window, and the sound of voices inside, and the smell of whatever was on the stove, and the shape of the man on the porch who always looked up when she came into his line of sight. The way he had looked up from that very first morning in the kitchen, like looking, was something he did by reflex. Now, like the habit of attending to her was built so deep in him it operated without instruction. And she would say, "I lost everything. And then I found out I'd been wrong about what everything was." That was the whole story. That was all of it. A widow with 4 children standing in the street with nothing left, and a cowboy who couldn't quite make himself keep riding. And everything that grew from that single turned-around decision, everything that took root in those empty rooms and filled them beyond what either of them had thought to ask for. Some things in this life don't arrive the way you planned them. They arrive at the wrong time through the wrong door, wearing the wrong clothes when you're standing in the mud with 4 children and $2 and the absolute certainty that the world has finished with you. And they turn out to be everything.